problem with the CPA is that it is in many ways a compromise, and the compromise itself has been written to a certain extent by external actors who have seen the war in very simple terms as a war between the North and the South, as a war between Muslims and non-Muslims, and to a certain extent as a war about underdevelopment. Does the CPA really enshrine a new idea of citizenship in the Sudan? There is language that talks about citizenship rights and equal rights, but are the structures of government really in place for allowing citizens to exercise those rights? Are the different political bodies in the Sudan incorporated into the CPA in a meaningful way, so that different political opinions, different political organizations have some impact on the way in which government functions and policy is either decided or implemented? But one of the things that I think is most striking, and a real question about the future of peace in the Sudan, is to what extent does the CPA remove the structures of totalitarianism and military dictatorship and the security apparatus, which has been so much in place over the last 20 years and which has been a major source of oppression for citizens right throughout the Sudan, not just in the south, not just in the marginalized areas, but in the whole center of the Sudan as well. Since the signing of the Machakos Protocol, which set up the format, the whole context of the war, I think that you can discern that there has been a development in different parts of the Sudan that have a direct bearing on the possibility of new forms of political activity or of civil society activity and of constitutional activity. Although the SPLA areas are seen by many to be weak in civil administration, they are also very strong in the activities of the civilian population, in the way in which they relate to the civil and military administration, as well as their own participation in the war and in government and administration. So that I think that there is great potential in those areas that were formerly or are currently under the control of the SPLA, in the development of more grassroots institutions, the participation of a civilian population in the administration of their own affairs through customary courts and that sort of thing. But there has been less progress in the center of the country and in the central government, those areas that are specifically dealt with in the CPA that set up constitutional structures of a presidency, of a national parliament, of a government of the South Sudan, of ministries, of state governments, etc., a hierarchy of highly bureaucratic institutions where in fact the participation of the citizenry might be fairly limited. One of the unresolved issues in the CPA was what to do about the Abyei area. There were three areas outside of the administrative boundaries of the southern Sudan: Blue Nile on the border with Ethiopia, the Nuba Mountains in the center part of the country, and Abyei, which is technically part of a northern province of Kordofan. Both of these were areas that were brought into the war. The population was affected by the war. The SPLA recruited soldiers from those areas and had garrisons in those areas and some sort of civil administration as well. They were subject to separate protocols and separate types of administrative solutions. Now, the Abyei area was interesting because one group of that very important southern Sudanese population, the Dinka, are come from Abyei, they live in Abyei, they have lived there for a number of centuries. And it is a matter of an historical accident to a certain extent that they, at the time of independence, they were included in a province which was considered to be part of the northern Sudan. This became a matter of real political controversy at the time of the First Civil War in the 1960s, when fighting from the southern Sudan spilled over into that part of Kordofan and affected that group of the Dinka people. Now, the Addis Ababa Agreement gave those people the option of deciding through a referendum whether they wished to join the southern region or remain under the administration of Kordofan. That referendum never took place. It was halted by the central government. The fact that it never took place was one of the grievances that led to the starting of the Second Civil War, and a number of persons from Abyei were very prominent in the SPLA at that time. The Abyei Protocol reinstates the right to a referendum for the people of that area to decide whether they wish to be part of the southern Sudan or not. What it does not define, however, is the territory of the Abyei area. It left that vague and established an Abyei Boundaries Commission to decide what the territory of Abyei was after the CPA was signed. Now, I was one of the international experts that acted on that Abyei Boundaries Commission. We presented our report. According to the CPA, the presidency was supposed to implement that report with immediate effect. Now, one of the things that was the problem about that whole Abyei Boundaries Commission was it was not so much don't mention the war as don't mention the oil. During the First Civil War, the issue was who was going to be using the pastures and the waters of that area, because this was an area that was shared by Dinka pastoralists and Arab pastoralists. However, oil has been discovered, and some of the oil that is being pumped out of the Sudan right now comes from the area of Abyei. The government clearly wanted to define the Abyei area so that most of the oil wells and the oil fields were included in the north. Unfortunately, they were not able to substantiate that position, and the boundaries that the Abyei Boundaries Commission established in fact do include quite a number of the oil field areas in the area of Abyei that originally was settled by the Dinka. That was in July 2005. As of now, which is April 2006, there has been no implementation of the Abyei Boundaries Commission, and there have been statements from the Assistant President that it will never be implemented. This raises some very important issues. One, the two sides signed the whole of the CPA, including the Abyei Protocol, committing themselves to implementing the CPA. Here is a protocol which one side is now saying they will not implement. How does that affect the potential implementation of the other aspects of the CPA? For instance, how will the boundary of the southern Sudan itself be determined if this one small area cannot be determined by prior agreement through a protocol in the CPA? Also, we're now talking about peace in Darfur, peace negotiations. If the government will not implement the Abyei Protocol, which is part of the CPA that they have already signed and agreed, how can we expect them to implement any aspect of a Darfur peace agreement with which they disagree? I think these are very serious issues that have been underestimated in the aftermath of the signing of the CPA. There are two different assumptions. On the one hand, there is the assumption by many Southerners, and certainly within the SPLM, that these people will return. and that they will return within the period of the interim agreement of 6 years, and therefore they will return to their original homes or the homes of their parents and be fully integrated into the economic and social and political life of the southern Sudan. On the other hand, there is the explicit assumption by many in the northern government, in the National Congress Party and the government of national unity, that these people will not return. That they are currently enjoying, as I have heard some northern officials say, services which are absent in a war-torn and war-devastated south, and that they will naturally wish to stay in Khartoum and in other parts of the north where they can get health service, education, and jobs. Now, I think that both assumptions are misplaced. I think that the government assumption that people living in the rubbish tips and the squatter camps around Khartoum are getting services, I think this is clearly absurd. On the other hand, there are some things that people can get in Khartoum which are absent in the southern Sudan in the year after the CPA was signed, and that there really will have to be a major effort in establishing services not just in the major cities such as Juba, but in the rural areas, because people who are already returning are finding themselves in distress. No health facilities, outbreaks of cholera, meningitis, which are not being seen to in the rural areas and not being dealt with by the health NGOs or by the government of South Sudan. And if that situation is not addressed and ameliorated, you will find that people may well return to the north looking for a greater sense of personal well-being if their security is now secured. Therefore, I think if the government of South Sudan wishes that their assumption will be brought to fruition, they have to do something about it to enable the return of southern Sudanese to the south. If they don't, then there is going to be a real argument about who is entitled to vote in the referendum. Will it be people who are resident in the South Sudan at the time of the referendum? Will it be people who were born in the South Sudan at some time before the war began? Will it be people who had grandparents who were born in the South Sudan? Are we going to see some sort of grandfather clause in the voting regulations for the referendum? These are things that are going to be real battles because they are not covered by the CPA, and there is no reason to believe that those persons in Khartoum who do not want to see a referendum and do not want the South to secede will just sit back and allow the SPLM to define how the referendum will be carried out. And that I'm sure that we will see attempts to restrict the franchise in the referendum in a variety of ways.